Tina, are we ready to start?
We are. Thank you. Proceed.
Okay, thank you. So this is an audio gavel. Welcome, everyone. I'm calling the April 6th City Council meeting to order. Again, we're doing a remote meeting, and before we move on to tonight's agenda items, I'd like to acknowledge what our remote meeting format looks like. On March 6th, I issued an emergency proclamation declaring a civil emergency in the city due to the COVID-19 outbreak. On March 24th, the governor issued Proclamation 20-28, prohibiting meetings that fall under the Open Public Meetings Act, such as our city council meetings, from being conducted in person. Tonight's meeting will be held entirely remotely. The audio of tonight's meeting will be recorded, streamed live, and available for later listening on the city's YouTube channel. A call-in number was provided on the meeting agenda for members of the public who wish to call in by phone to listen to the live meeting. Those who provided advance notice, and there are a few, are also able to make comments under the audience comment portion of the meeting. Email was also encouraged for this meeting, and it will be acknowledged later on. As a reminder, there will be no meeting video. Any staff presentations will be limited to the materials posted on the online agenda packet. Staff will make every effort to specify which materials they are referencing so everyone can follow along. There will be an executive session this evening to discuss collective bargaining per RCW 42.30, 1.140(4), and pending potential litigation for RCW 42.30.110(1). These items are expected to last 30 minutes, and no action is anticipated in open session. So at this point, I'd like to take a moment to take the roll call of the council members in attendance. Please say here when I call your name. Councilmember DeMichelle. Here. Councilmember Goodman. Here. Councilmember Hall.
Here.
Council President Hunt. Here. Councilmember Marks.
Here.
Deputy Council President Ray.
Here.
And Councilmember Walsh.
Here.
Thank you. In addition, the following city staff are participating in tonight's meeting. City Administrator Wally Bobkowitz, Deputy City Administrator Andrea Snyder, City Attorney Jim Haney, City Clerk Tina Eggers, Deputy City Clerk Tisha Giescher, Finance Director Beth Goldberg, and Senior Budget Analyst Susie Monsell. For those members of the public on the call, welcome. The clerk or I will call on you to make comments when we reach that portion of the agenda. So the meeting guidelines. Before we begin, I'd like to reiterate some of the guidelines we'll be using in our online meeting today. Council members, please use the Skype meeting messenger to let me know when you wish to speak. And for those council members on the phone, I will pause at appropriate times so you can indicate when you want to speak. And for all that are participating in the meeting today, please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. For all meeting attendees, state your name each time before speaking. And for council members, that's including before you ask a question, before you make a motion or second a motion, or before you participate in debate. Speak clearly and pause frequently. It will be a little awkward in the audio later on, but we need to allow for the pauses so that we can track who wants to speak and give them time to get on and off of mute. So thank you for your patience. At this point in time, I would ask everybody to make sure they are muted. And I'd also like to give you the opportunity to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The next item on our agenda this evening is the Mayor's Report. This is not the usual order for the Mayor's Report. This agenda order is slightly different. My message this evening is a very large, general overview for the community about the COVID issue and what the city is doing. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. It is hard to pretend that our council meeting tonight is in any way typical of the many meetings we do every year. In 5 short weeks, our world has been turned upside down due to a global pandemic that is still working its way across our country. It is stressful and anxious for both residents and businesses, for the health of our families and friends, and for the uncertainty that we are living with, and for the economic impacts, which will not be short-lived. Tonight, Council will receive a financial update on our city and hold a discussion about where we are financially and what possible actions the city may need to take to ensure we stay solvent and are able to provide services to the community. Before we start tonight, I want to say a few words of gratitude to our residents that are following the physical distancing guidelines, to those that still support our local restaurants by purchasing meals to go, and to the amazing team spirit of our community, our homeowners groups, our clubs, our businesses, and all of those who are chipping in to support the community. Your efforts are not unnoticed. Thank you many, many times over. As a community, we need to ensure that the basic needs are being met for those whose lives have been upended. We are working hard to connect our residents with resources to ensure they have a roof over their head and food to eat. The city supports many nonprofit social service providers in our community, and at the March 23rd, 2020 special meeting, the council increased the human services funding by 20%, and that will be distributed to agencies that provide rental relief. Since the council's authorization of funds towards rental assistance, to date, 58 households have received help through the program. The city staff and organizations providing rental assistance will continue to monitor the volume of requests received in the upcoming weeks and provide a more comprehensive report at the next council meeting. We are also working with county, state, and federal partners to figure out how funding from those levels of governments can ensure at this difficult time that folks still have a roof over their head through the months ahead. The second basic need for individuals is food security. We know that paychecks have disappeared along with jobs. We anticipate the needs for assistance to dramatically rise over the next few weeks and potentially months. We have a strong network of providers in town, but more assistance is needed. This past Friday, the city organized a virtual call to discuss our local food program. 7 organizations joined this call to tell us the specific needs of their agencies and how the groups can collaborate to meet the growing demand. This call was productive and resulted in several ideas for future collaboration on purchasing and procurement, sharing food and volunteer resources, and continued information sharing. Tonight, I'd like to highlight the Issaquah Food and Clothing Bank. Though they've changed their service delivery model, the food bank is providing emergency food boxes to approximately 350 households in the Issaquah area. Our city staff are working closely with the food bank to help ensure that they will continue to remain open, preparing for staffing contingencies and the potential for a dramatic increase in demand for their services in the months to come. This month, we will be receiving some assistance from the National Guard, who will be helping the food bank with their distribution, packing, and other aspects of their operations. National Guard members will be in our community tomorrow, as well as April 9th, 21st, and 23rd. I hope you will join me in welcoming their assistance. Here's a few ways to help those struggling with food insecurity right now. Although drop-off donations are not currently being accepted, you can help provide food by having items shipped directly to the Issaquah Food and Clothing Bank from their emergency needs list, which can be found on the food bank website at issaquahfoodbank.org. You can check on your neighbors and encourage anyone who might need a little extra help with food or resources to visit the food bank website or send an email to info@issaquahfoodbank.org. info@issaquahfoodbank.org. The food bank is preparing for a marathon, and we will need more volunteers as time goes on. Check their website periodically for updates on volunteer needs. And for all of us who have what we need in our pantries, please be sensitive to not overshop. This puts a strain on the food system, making it difficult for food banks to acquire the products they need to serve our most vulnerable residents. Before we begin our meeting today, I want to reach out to all the residents and families in our community, those that have lost jobs, or have experienced the direct and dire impacts of the COVID-19 virus on their family and their loved ones. We are a strong and caring community, and we are all here for you. Know that we are trying to help you during this incredibly hard time. And thank you to Issaquah for staying home. Even though it is inconvenient and times are anxious right now, you are doing the right thing for you, for your family, and for our amazing Issaquah community. Act safe and stay well. Now back to our regular agenda. At this point in time, we are up for audience comments. And I know we have at least 2 individuals who have signed up to speak this evening. And Tisha or Tina, who will be inviting our audience to speak?
Certainly. This is Clerk Gager speaking. First on our list is, well, we have 2 speakers, Larry Franks, and I'm not certain if he's on the line. If so, and then Mariah Batiste, and I have confirmation that she's online.
Thank you very much. Larry, if you're online, would you please come off mute and share your thoughts with our council?
Yes, ma'am. This is Larry Franks. Am I coming through okay?
We can hear you just fine. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Mrs. Mayor. Madam Mayor. I'm a resident at 24001 Southeast 103rd Street in Issaquah for the last 48 years. What I wanted to share was that the coronavirus pandemic is a serious threat to our way of life. How it was handled by our federal administration, removing pandemic safeguards in 2018, denial of the severity of the threat, and totally inaccurate statements of risk to the American population were deadly. Many more Americans will die in this pandemic than if a federal government was cogent, listened to the medical experts as the threat was emerging. This sets the stage for the impact of climate change. The data is clear. If we as a city, country, and world stay on our current path, the ice caps will melt, sea level will rise, drought and wildfires will become more commonplace. Many ecosystems producing our food will collapse. Instead of hundreds of thousands of deaths due to the pandemic, we would see hundreds of millions of deaths due to the impacts of a warming climate. How can any thinking person stand by and let this occur? We must take the hard lessons learned from fighting and overcoming the pandemic and apply them immediately to climate change. Stop denial. Take appropriate action. Acknowledge that it'll take resources, long-term commitments to turn this around. I'm certain the city of Issaquah will do what it can to bring this about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franks. Before we proceed with audience comments, I have missed an entire page of my script. It is not easy to manage multiple different screens and documents at once. Mr. Franks has presented before council before and is aware of the guidelines, but for anyone else on the phone this evening with us, I'm going to go over the guidelines in case you have not spoken in front of council before. Citizen comments are extremely important part of the public process. We take them seriously, and council factors them into the decisions that we make. Please direct comments to the whole council and not individuals. And while this is not a question and answer session, we will contact you to follow up if needed. When you are recognized, please unmute your microphone. *6 may be an option on your phone if you're looking for a way to unmute. Please state your name, your address, and your relationship to the city. Are you a resident, a property owner, a business owner? Speak clearly and pause frequently. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes and remute your microphone when done. If you do not respond after your name or phone number is called, or if your connection is lost unexpectedly, the meeting will still need to proceed. You are encouraged to rejoin the meeting if able. Personal attacks, obscene language, derogatory remarks, and disruptive behavior is not permitted. If a speaker is out of order, I will ask them to stop and mute their microphone. If a speaker does not comply, I may direct staff to have their microphone muted. If a disruption to the meeting occurs and order cannot be restored, I may direct staff to remove you from the call. Citizen comments, written and verbal, are an important aspect of the public process, and the City Council takes these comments very seriously. And we thank you for taking the time to address us during our meetings. As a reminder, written comments can be submitted at any time to citycouncil@issaquah.gov. And if comments were sent in by email, they will be acknowledged later this evening by Council President Hunt as we move through the agenda. Next one up to speak is former council member Mariah Batiste.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Hi, this is Mariah Batiste. I'm an Issaquah resident, former council member. I'm at 1281 Northeast Hickory Lane. First of all, I'm hoping every one of you, mayor, council members, administration staff, and your families are doing well and healthy. I wish I could see your smiling faces in person tonight. I miss all of you, and I'm always thinking of you. It's hard not to be there right now. To our community members, I'm wishing you are all safe and well at this time as well, and I'm sending all my best wishes for safety and health to our community, and really wanted to thank all of our first responders, police, fire fighters, and all of our medical professionals as we deal with this tremendously difficult crisis. Tonight, I was calling in because I wanted to thank all of you, mayor, council, administration, and staff, for the important and effective job that you're doing during this crisis. I wanted to commend you on the proclamation of emergency a month ago. Thank you for being so proactive for our community. The temporary moratorium on residential tenant late fees and the deferment of B&O taxes for our small businesses, those items are all so incredibly important right now. The website looks great, and it really gives all of the resources that I think people are needing to. It's very easy to navigate, and I can find all the information that I'm looking for. I also really like the hashtag #AskIssaquah, and seeing the city council members on video answering the questions. It's really important to be able to see our leaders' faces right now during this unnerving time, so I really appreciated seeing that. I also very much appreciate the link for helping others. The mayor was just talking about how all of our nonprofits are really struggling at this time, and it's so important for all of us to be reaching out and helping one another. And so I was just really happy to see that link, and also to learn just tonight about the 20% increase for the human services funding. So thank you. Thank you to council, the mayor, the administration, and the staff. Tonight's conversation for council, I've had a chance to look through the presentation, and it's just an incredibly hard, difficult, and sobering reminder of what we will be facing from an economic perspective as a result of the COVID crisis. And my thoughts have really centered on defining our community's basic needs, including our health and safety. I think that's probably where everybody's heads are right now. And another thought that just popped into my head as I was getting ready to get on the call is that we had discussed in the past about having a future conversation about what services should we be offering, what should we be doing in Issaquah, what should we be supporting. And as we really look at that bleak financial picture, thinking that queuing up that conversation might be important at this time. But all I know is that I'm very happy to have all of you at the helm. I believe in you and your leadership, and with all of you, I know that we're going to make it through and come out the other side. And I just wanted to thank all of you for all of your efforts so far during this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, former council member Batiste. It's awfully nice to hear your voice as well.
Yours too. Thank you.
So I appreciate both of our speakers who called in this evening. The next item of business on the agenda tonight is committee and regional reports. I will call each council member by name. Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. I have two quick reports. The first report is for Cascade Water Alliance. On Wednesday, this is Councilmember Zach Hall. Sorry, I forgot to announce before.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, March 25th, the Cascade Water Alliance Board of Directors held a short meeting. We only had two major items of business on the agenda, including committee appointments. Mayor Polly, who's the official voting member for the city, was appointed to the Finance and Management Committee, and I'm the alternate member for the city, was appointed to the Resource Management Committee. And our only other order of business was to cancel until further action by the board all standing committees. So we appointed people and then we canceled it due to the public health crisis. So our next regular meeting is on Wednesday, April 22nd at 3:30 p.m. This meeting will take place by a conference call, and details can be found on their website at cascadewater.org. My next quick report is for the Regional Affordable Housing Committee. Last week's Regional Affordable Housing Committee meeting, originally scheduled for Monday, March 30th, was canceled due to the public health crisis. Our next regularly scheduled meeting is tentatively scheduled for May 15th, and I'll be sure to share more details with the council and the community as I get those. But with the passage of House Bill 2432 by the state legislature, the committee now has an additional 6 months to recommend amendments to the countywide planning policies for the consideration of the Growth Management Planning Council. So I'm not worried about the amount of work our committee has to do between now and that deadline. And again, I'll be sure to share additional details with administration, with council, and with the community as I get them. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. Councilmember DeMichelle.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. This is Councilmember DeMichelle, and I have two reports. On March 19th, there was a phone conference meeting for Eastside Human Services. It seems as though that the time is so skewed on some of these meetings. That was 5 days before the governor announced the stay home, stay healthy announcements. So many of the things that we discussed are no longer, relevant. So I won't report on those. It was a very well attended meeting. We had elected officials from Redmond, Bellevue, Kirkland, and Issaquah, and I was elected to the board at that time. We had the executive directors of Friends of Youth and HopeLink, and a board member for the Perkins Coie law firm, and representatives from Evergreen and Overlake Hospitals. So there was a very excellent exchange about what is happening with our nonprofits and human services organizations on the East Side. We were asked what our biggest challenge was, and I will just give you a brief summary, but I think these are things that are very common to any organization that's providing services right now. Everyone agreed that the biggest challenge is stopping the spread of the virus. That is job number one for every organization that's working with people right now. It was shared commonly that all human services and healthcare workers are stressed and anxious. People are very worried about employee burnout, and people are taking steps to guard the mental health of the employees who are serving the public and right there on the front lines for us. There was quite a bit of discussion about how the funding model for many of our nonprofits has simply collapsed in a very short order in the last month. Both Friends of Youth and HopeLink had canceled spring fundraisers that account for a significant portion of their annual revenue, and they are scrambling to find other ways of continuing their revenue streams. There's been a very rapid transition from person-to-person service to online services, and this is occurring at a time when the need is increasing and when the revenue may not be there to support this transition. However, nonprofits are stepping up and doing the best they can to transition to online services for their clients. It was interesting to hear from the Perkins Coie representative that this pandemic has created a mountain, he called it, of legal issues and questions and concerns. And so it was interesting to hear that perspective. And then finally, the executive director from Friends of Youth spoke quite eloquently to the uncertainty of the situation we're facing and the fact that it's difficult to plan, and yet we must plan, as we will face later this evening. So people are making plans in an environment where the news is changing daily. So that's a summary of the comments from that discussion. The next Eastside Human Services Forum meeting is May the 21st. And then I have a very brief report on the Healthier Here Board, which met on April 2nd. At that meeting, the board unanimously voted to release $1,250,000 of previously unallocated funding to address the COVID-19 crisis, and those funds are all directed toward meeting the Healthier Here's mission of integrating physical and behavioral health in King County's public health network. The board also unanimously approved increased authorization for the executive director and executive board to make some additional final decisions regarding further release of unallocated funds. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. Councilmember Walsh?
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh, and I have no report.
Thank you. Councilmember Goodman?
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman here. One short report. Eastside Fire and Rescue has canceled its meetings for April, and Fireground 101, which had been scheduled for May 16th, has also been postponed, and I will report out when that has been rescheduled for later this year. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Councilmember Martz?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is Councilmember Tola Martz. The Thursday, April 2nd, Puget Sound Regional Council Growth Management Policy Board meeting was canceled, and the upcoming Wednesday, April 8th, Sound Cities Association Public Issues Committee meeting is unlikely to be held. This concludes my report.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Deputy Council President Ray?
Hi, this is Chris Ray. I have no report this evening, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Nice and short. Thank you. Council President Hunt?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have one report this evening. The WIRA 8 Salmon Recovery Council met on Thursday, March 19th. WIRA 8 is the name for our watershed. And the Salmon Recovery Council had one item, which was to approve a funding request using carry forward funding for a study of predatory fishes in the Lake Washington Ship Canal. This has been identified as a top priority to support salmon recovery. And we also had a report out by the WIRA 8 Salmon Recovery Technical Committee regarding regarding some work that they've been doing on artificial lighting concerns. And the outcome so far from this work was a letter that was provided for Issaquah, which will support our Shoreline Master Program work so that we can have the most up-to-date science in our Shoreline Master Program going forward. And the next meeting relevant to salmon is the Kokanee ILA Management Committee meeting. This is the first time that we will meet, and this is about kokanee, which is a very endangered local type of salmon. We will be meeting on Tuesday, April 7th at 1 o'clock, and that concludes my report.
Thank you, Council President Hunt. The next item on our agenda this evening is the consent calendar, and just as a reminder, due to tonight's meeting format, we will be taking all votes as roll call votes. The consent calendar was distributed to Council in advance, and if authorized, the items on the consent calendar will be considered together and approved by one motion. Have the payables and payroll been reviewed?
They have.
They have.
And that was Councilmember Goodman and Hall.
And Hall, thank you.
Thank you very much. Does any council member desire to remove any item from the consent calendar and consider it under regular business? Before we move to the motion, Council President Hunt, do you have any email comments that were shared with Council on consent calendar items?
Yes, this is Council President Hunt, and thank you for the opportunity to summarize some of these comments. So this is a summary of emails that we received regarding specific items that are on the consent calendar. Elizabeth Mopan wrote to us in support of AB 7944, the 2020 ARCH Work Plan and Budget. Steve Pereira wrote to us on multiple items. He questioned the bang for the buck on AB 7921, Port of Seattle Economic Development Grant. And he wrote in opposition to AB 7928, the PSRC Surface Transportation Block Grant Program and Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Grants, and was generally supportive of the ARCH and ARCH program budget item, and that would be AB 7944. And then we did receive some comments on the funding for COVID-19 crisis, and I will share those when we discuss that later in the evening.
Thank you, Council President Hunt. Is there a motion?
Yes, this is Council President Hunt. I'd like to make a motion.
Go ahead, please.
Second by Ray.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I move to adopt the consent calendar as listed in this evening's agenda.
We'll try that again. Second.
It's been moved and seconded by Council President and Deputy Council President to approve the consent calendar as submitted. All those in favor, say aye. Sorry? Aye. Look at me, I'm already forgetting. I'm going to return to the City Clerk for the roll call vote.
Yes, Councilmember DeMichelle.
Aye.
Councilmember Goodman.
Aye.
Councilmember Hall.
Aye.
Council President Hunt.
Aye.
Councilmember Martz.
Aye.
Deputy Council President Ray.
Aye.
Councilmember Walsh.
Aye.
7 ayes, 0 nays.
Thank you. This is still weird doing it this way. Okay, we're moving on to the next item, which is regular business. ID 0673-2020, the financial and work plan impacts of COVID-19. There will be a report out this evening and an opportunity for Council to provide feedback to the administration. I'd like to ask Finance Director Beth Goldberg and Deputy City Administrator Andrea Snyder to present this item. Thank you.
Good evening. This is Beth Goldberg. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just great.
Okay, perfect. So I am speaking to item number 7A on the agenda, and for people following at home, the link is the second item, the view presentation button on the agenda. What we're presenting tonight is an updated financial forecast. If we could move to slide 2, I will provide an overview of what we are discussing tonight. So the purpose of the presentation is to provide a revised revenue forecast. This revenue forecast was generated about a week ago in response to the COVID-19 emergency. And then when I'm done presenting that, I will turn it over to Deputy City Administrator Andrea Snyder to lead a discussion about the types of things we're looking at to reduce expenditures, and then to solicit feedback from the City Council. If we can now move to slide number 3, please. We will be seeking direction from Council this evening on feedback for the criteria for the changes we're evaluating, as well as feedback on funding priorities. And as I said, Deputy City Administrator Snyder will be leading that portion of the discussion. If we can move on to slide 4 now, please. So before we talk about 2020, I want to take a brief short minute to talk about our 2019 year-end results. We have not had a chance to discuss these, and the table on this slide demonstrates that We ended 2019 almost exactly as forecast, and this does suggest that the forecast models and tools that we put in place last year were sound and were good tools for forecasting what was going to happen. I also want to point out, and there's a memo in your packet about this, that we ended on a strong note with sales tax last year. The early part of the year, sales tax showed some weakness, but we ended the year strong, and I'm also pleased to report that our January 2020 sales tax results were also strong, up about 8%. But as I've been saying a lot lately, that was so last year. So that's probably about the last bit of good news that you will hear me sharing this evening. And if we can move now to slide 5, I'd like to start talking through what we are seeing for 2020. And, you know, in a nutshell, it's not good. So we prepared this forecast a little over a week ago. And as a result of that forecast, we are anticipating a nearly 10 million drop in general fund revenues, or approximately 20% of the general fund. Before going into the details of the forecast, I did want to point out and provide some important caveats that I'd like you all to keep in mind as you're listening to the presentation tonight. The first caveat is that we are in extraordinarily challenging times, and this makes it very difficult to prepare the forecast. We're basically, in many respects, flying blind because we've never seen in modern history a sudden and near complete shutdown of the economy. We just don't have good benchmarks to guide what might be happening. We also don't have access to real-time data to shed light on the actual impacts. As I will explain throughout this presentation, we could be facing unprecedented lags in the receipt of data, meaning we could be flying blind for some time to come. The second caveat that I want to point out is that we're in an economic and financial environment that's changing rapidly. I mentioned this forecast was prepared a week ago, and a lot has changed, unfortunately, in the week since the forecast was developed. Some of the things that have changed include the Washington State stay-at-home order being extended, and just today, I'm sure you all heard that schools in the state will be closed through the end of the school year. Also last week, and this is at the national level, we got the new jobless claims report, and it was pretty dire. An additional 6.6 million claims came in last week over the 3.3 million claims the week before. So that puts us nationally at 10 million jobless claims in 2 weeks. And just as a point of reference, that exceeds the total job loss during the entire period of the Great Recession, when there was, I think, about 8.5 million jobs lost. So we're in really unprecedented times. So with all those caveats in mind, I want to start walking through what we've got for the forecast. And if we could switch over to slide 6, please. So on this slide, we are highlighting the changes to what we call the Big Four revenues. And of the $10 million loss in revenues that we're forecasting, almost 2 million of that comes from these Big Four revenues. And I'm going to go through each one of these and explain the rationale of the forecast and what we'll be watching as time unfolds. So first is property tax. This is typically a stable revenue source because it is not tied to property values, but rather it's a 1% increase on what was assessed in the previous year. So as there are changes in property values, we shouldn't see fluctuations here. But we are recommending that we take this revenue down by about 10% because we are anticipating that we are going to see defaults on mortgages, and with that may see defaults on people's property tax payments. It's also important to note that we may see lags in the receipt of this revenue. King County announced last week that it is extending the deadline for reporting property tax for a segment of taxpayers. Originally, or typically, property taxes are due April 30th, but King County has extended it to June 1st. This will be for property owners that are paying their property tax directly, as opposed to those who are paying their property tax through their mortgage payment. So it's about 45% of taxpayers that may be eligible for delaying their property taxes. And I see there's maybe a question, so I will pause here for a moment.
This is the mayor. Not sure what's doing that. I get a lot of feedback. I just want to make sure that council has the opportunity to ask questions as we go. So I appreciate it that you're taking a break, and I believe Councilmember Goodman has a question.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman here. So Director Goldberg, I guess I just wanted to ask, because I didn't see it in the materials when we were talking about real property taxes, that as we're talking about delays in collection, that you're also keeping in mind that one of the outcomes of this could be a drop in market value, and that could that also affect the amount we collect? How does that factor into all of this? Because that could be a delayed problem.
Yeah, can I jump in now? Just want to make sure I'm not cutting you off. Okay, so the way property tax is structured in Washington State, it's actually not tied to property values. So the way it works is we, the city of Issaquah, assess an amount in 2019, and then for 2020, the amount that we assess is 1% above what was assessed in the previous year. So property value does not matter in this case. In other places, it is tied to property values, but it is not. That's not the case in Washington State. So that's one thing that we don't have to worry about here. Where we might have some concerns is, in addition to the 1%, we're allowed to collect the value of new construction. So if this economic slowdown slows down the pace of new construction, then that might impact future growth. But of the nearly $10 million that we're anticipating collecting for property tax in 2020, only about 200,000 of that is anticipated to be for new construction. So it's a fairly small segment of our property tax base.
Councilmember Goodman, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. It has to do with how it would be, that amount that we collect is spread over the values. Anyway, okay, I just wanted I didn't see that. I just wanted to raise that. Thanks.
Yes, but you're right. It's how that 1% is spread over the value would be how it impacts the taxpayer in subsequent years.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Director Goldberg, that means the mill rate then would be moving in an upward direction as housing prices went down?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
There's no other questions, and I'm not seeing any right now. Please continue, and I think that was an appropriate span of time in your presentation, that if we do that again and stop for questions, that would be good.
Okay, that sounds great. And feel free to send me a note if you want me to pause. So the last thing I want to mention about property tax, before I move on to sales tax, is there have been some reports recently about projections of default rates on mortgages, and Moody's, their chief economist, was predicting that if the economy remains closed through the summer, we could see 30% of Americans default on their home loans. So this default rate that we're assuming of 10% is modest in comparison to that, but we also don't know that we're going to stay shut down through the summer. So we will be watching that as time unfolds. Now I'm going to move on to sales tax. And to forecast sales tax, we looked at the city of Issaquah's experience during the Great Recession. During the period between 2007 and 2009, Issaquah saw a nearly 30% drop in sales tax. This was gradual back then. It happened over a 2-year period of time. This time, we're taking that 30% mark, and we're assuming that it happens essentially immediately because the economy has essentially shut down. Whether this forecast holds or not, it's about a 4.7 million drop in the forecast, will depend on the length of time the economy is shut down and how quickly the economy bounces back. So again, this is one where we're going to have to watch closely. This is our largest revenue source and our most volatile revenue source. I do feel like I need to highlight here, and it certainly mentioned this in your council materials, that we will likely not see actual sales tax data for March until midsummer. Normally, there's a 2-month lag on when we receive sales tax data from the state, meaning that we would have received March data at the end of May. However, this past Friday, the State Department of Revenue announced that it is extending the filing deadline for businesses until June 25th. So there is going to be a long period and probably an uncomfortable period of time where we're waiting to see what the actual impact of this is on our sales tax, with March being the first month. And as a reminder, sales tax makes up 32% of general fund revenues. And I will pause there before going on to business and occupation tax.
Thank you, Director. Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. Beth, when I was looking at some of your other information, it appears that the lowest point in 2009 for our sales tax brought in approximately $9 billion that year. So is this projection, which you say is based on the worst of what was happening during that Great Recession, is this 11 million a little bit higher because January and most of February weren't affected, or is it a little bit higher because of inflation? What influences that?
Yes, so the drop between 2007 and 2009 was about 30%. It was 20 point some odd percent. So I didn't look at the gross numbers back then because the sales tax base was different back then, but I applied that 30% factor to the 2020 adopted revenue assumptions, which happened to be also the revenue assumptions that we were assuming for 2019. So I applied that 30% to the $15 million assumption that was in the budget, because our base and the $2 million difference that you're citing is largely because the base that we're starting with in 2019, 2020 was a larger base, a higher base than was the case in 2007 when the Great Recession started.
Thank you. That's perfect.
Thank you, Councilmember Walsh. I'm not seeing any more questions, Director Goldberg, so continue on.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the business and occupation tax. And looking back at the Great Recession, this was actually a stable revenue source during the Great Recession. It actually increased modestly during that period of time. But for this forecast, we're assuming we're not going to have the same experience. Given the number of businesses that have had to shut down because of the stay-at-home orders, we're assuming that this is a revenue source that's going to be significantly impacted, and we are applying the same 30% reduction that we assumed for sales tax to our B&O sales tax base. And in doing this, it takes that revenue source down by nearly $2 million. Like sales tax and like property tax, this is another revenue source where we are likely going to see lags in the receipt of our revenues. On March 26th, the mayor announced the city would grant B&O filing extensions for small businesses. Other nearby cities have also done this, including the city of Seattle and the city of Bellevue. So normally, small businesses would file their first quarter B&O taxes by April 30th. But under this extension, small businesses will have until July 31st to file. So again, we will likely see lags in the receipt of this revenue stream. And I will pause there before moving on to utility tax.
Thank you for the pause. I can see that Councilmember Ray has a question.
Thank you. And Beth, sorry, this is Councilmember Chris Ray. Beth, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned that a number of businesses that were concerned about having ceasing operations. Do we have any data yet on the business impact of the current crisis?
Not that I am personally aware of. I don't know if Jen Davis-Hayes is on, if she has any information that she could share, or if City Administrator Bobkowitz has any information.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Ray, Ms. Davis-Hayes is gathering that information. We're working closely with our partners. I think we would hope to have more information over the next couple of weeks as we get some better estimates.
Okay. And then just a quick follow-on to that. I can do the math, but I'm feeling challenged today. What's the percentage that you're estimating the reduction there? It looks fairly substantial.
We're applying the 30% reduction to B&O, similar to what we did for sales tax. And also, I should add, in case someone wants to do the math on the spot, did not apply the 30% to what we actually collected in 2019, because the 2020 budget assumed a modest increase in business and occupation tax. So the 30% is on last year's actual collections.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Council Ray, President Ray. Director Goldberg, if you want to continue on with utility tax.
Yes. So utility tax, this is typically also a relatively stable revenue source. People need to continue to heat their homes, use water, things of that nature. However, there are two sectors within utility tax that are more elastic and ones where we've actually seen a steady decline in recent years, and that is utility tax on telephone and cable. As taxpayers see their financial situations deteriorate, we're anticipating that there will be an acceleration in the decline of cable and television if people are looking for ways to cut back on their expenses. So the forecast that we're presenting here assumes an acceleration in that rate of decline, basically doubling what we had built into the 2020 budget. And then for the remaining sectors, we're assuming a 10% decline. Again, as people are struggling to pay their bills, we're assuming there might be a decline either in usage or people's ability to pay. Like the other revenues that I've talked about tonight, we are also anticipating a lag in the receipt of these revenues. The city and other utility companies in the area are offering payment plans to those who are struggling to pay their bills. So we might see some lags in how this revenue starts to roll in as well. And I will pause there.
I am not seeing that there are any questions lined up, so please continue, Director Goldberg.
Okay, if we can move to slide 7, please. Okay, so slide 7 shows our other revenue categories, and we're taking these down by a more modest level, about $1.8 million. And I'm going to walk through, similar to the previous slide, I'm going to walk through each one of these categories and explain the rationale for the changes that we are making. The first category is other taxes, and we're taking this down about just over $8,000 from the adopted budget. In this revenue category, we get revenues from pull tabs and gambling amusement games, and we're taking these revenues down by 25%, assuming a 3-month shutdown from the stay-at-home and physical distancing orders, and thus fewer pull tabs and use of the amusement gambling games. I'll pause there before I move on to planning, permits, and licensing for any questions.
Seeing any at this time? Thank you.
Okay, so planning, permits, and licenses, we've got a number of large projects in the pipeline, and we are assuming that those projects are going to continue, and the revenue from that source would continue. In terms of revenue from routine work, DSD staff is largely anticipating that will hold up because there's a backlog of permits, so DSD staff will be working through that backlog. But for forecasting purposes, we are taking this revenue from the more routine work down by about 10%, or the $200,000 that you are seeing on this slide. And I will pause there in case there are any questions.
No questions at this time.
Okay. The next revenue category is public safety and enforcement, and we're taking this down by nearly $450,000. The forecast assumes that the stay-at-home and physical distancing orders will depress court revenues, jail revenues, and other smaller revenues in this category for roughly 3 months. So for that, as I said, we're taking that down by about $450,000. And I'll pause again there.
It looks like Councilmember Martz may have a question. Councilmember Martz.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor. What sort of revenues are revolving around public safety and enforcement do people not do during a stay-at-home order?
Yes, so a couple of things are going home is people are not on the roads issuing fewer traffic citations. The jail has reduced its jail population to try and ensure the safety and health of the inmates in the jail. So we've got fewer inmates in the jail that we're housing for other jurisdictions, so getting less revenue for that. And so that's the kind of thing that's depressing those revenues.
Thank you very much.
Director Goldberg, is court included in public safety and enforcement or not?
It is. It is. So that's where, so for example, the traffic citations, that shows up is as a court revenue. And so if fewer people are on the roads, fewer traffic citations are being issued, there will be less revenue coming in for that.
Okay, thank you. Please continue.
Okay, so the next category is parks and recreation, and that one, again, we're assuming that the stay-at-home and physical distancing orders will remain in place for 3 months and are reducing recreation programming revenues accordingly. And that also, I'm wondering if there's a typo on that slide, because it's the exact same number, but we're taking that down as well. And I'll pause there for any questions.
Thank you. We do have a question from Councilmember DiMichele.
Beth, going back to public safety and enforcement, and you mentioned that there wouldn't be as many people in the jail. Does your forecast take into account the savings, for example, on food and other items for those people who are incarcerated? Or are we just now looking at revenues and we'll look at possible savings from some of these things later on? Or have you taken that into account in these figures?
We have not taken that savings into account in these figures. This is, as you pointed out, just looking at the revenues. But as we look to the expenditures as part of this next phase, leading towards April 20th, certainly some of these activities where we're seeing declines in use, and the jail is an example of one of them, and parks, frankly, is another example where we don't have the part-time staff needed to run our recreation programs. We will see a natural level of savings that is generated as a result of those shutdowns, and we'll certainly be capturing that in what we report back on April 20th. You know, unfortunately, it's not going to be enough to close the entirety of that gap, but some of that natural savings will be captured. Well, all of it will be captured, and that part will be, you know, the air quote, the kind of the easy part of this.
Right. Okay.
Certainly, there will be, you know, many other difficult decisions, but that natural savings will be captured.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Goldberg. I just want to check back in. Deputy Council President Ray, did I miss you on a question?
No, you got me. Thank you.
Awesome. Council President Hunt has a comment and or question.
Yes, this is Council President Hunt. I noticed the duplication of the same numbers under the public safety and enforcement and parks and recreation difference from adopted, and it does look like, based on the information in our packet, it does look like that's a typo. And parks and recreation in our packet, the difference is 395,352, so 395,352.
Director Goldberg?
Yes, thank you. So the next one I'm going to talk about is cost allocations, and I'm actually going to lump it with the last line on the chart on this slide, transfers in, and talk about those together. And the forecast assumes that both of these are stable. These are internal transfers between funds, and we are not anticipating any change in those two categories. And then next, I'm going to talk about the miscellaneous revenue category, and there are several revenues within this category that I want to talk about. The first of which is passport revenue, which is captured in this miscellaneous roll-up. The city provides passport services where people could come in and renew their passports, and we get revenue for that, for doing that service. We are assuming that that activity is suspended during the for 3 months during the stay-at-home orders, and then when we do open back up again, we're assuming a 50% decline in passport activities because we're anticipating that the interest and demand for international travel will decline for the balance of the year. So together that brings about an $85,000, or I'm sorry, it's $85,000 is the budgeted amount, and we're taking that down based on what I just described. Also in this category is investment interest income. We do invest our cash balances in safe investments and earn modest amounts of investment income. About $440,000 was budgeted in the 2020 budget for this revenue. We're bringing that down by half, and we're bringing it down by half for two primary reasons. First, the interest rates have fallen pretty substantially, and also as our cash balances decline, we will have fewer balances to invest, and so that will reduce our investment income as well. Also in this revenue category are revenues from rents and leases, including renting out parks facilities. And like other items that we've talked about, we're assuming a 3-month shutdown and a reduction in revenues from parks facilities rentals as a result. And then the last category, well, maybe I'll pause and see if there are any questions about the miscellaneous category before I move on to shared intergovernmental revenues.
Thank you, Director Goldberg. I do not see any questions.
Okay, so the shared and intergovernmental revenues are where we're receiving a variety of revenues, mostly from the state. The one that council members are likely most familiar with is the streamlined sales tax revenues that we get from the state. For the purposes of this forecast, we reduced this revenue line by $128,000 and then applied the 30% reduction to sales tax on the balance. However, we learned on Friday that the governor has vetoed this line item in the state budget, meaning we won't receive any revenue from this source after July. So it's likely when we're updating the forecast that we're going to need to take this revenue source down a little bit farther. And then the last area in this category is took liquor-related revenues down by 10% based on closures of restaurants and things of that nature, but liquor stores remain open, so otherwise are assuming that that revenue will come in as normal. And I'll pause there.
Thank you, Director Goldberg. Councilmember March, you have a question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My question is whether we know the magnitude of the financial impact to Issaquah of the governor's veto.
For the streamlined sales tax or all revenue sources?
Of the veto that he issued.
Yes, so he vetoed a variety of things, but the one that I've heard that directly impacts us is the streamlined sales tax. We had assumed $420,000 in the budget for that. And so if you assume that, we won't get it after July, you could take that down by half. But some of that also depends on the extent of sales tax activity for March, April, and May.
Well, that is unfortunate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Director Good.
Okay, so can we move to slide 8 now, please? So as I mentioned earlier, this was not as much of an expenditure exercise. That will be the next phase of this. But for forecasting purposes, we did look at how we've spent our budgets in past years, and typically we've spent 96-97% of our expenditures through the end of the year. For the purposes of this forecast, we actually moved that to 98% because council may recall that in adopting the budget last year, we tightened up how we're budgeting a number of expenses, including we captured a 1% underspend on salaries and benefits. And we also tightened up how we are budgeting benefits, trying to get that a little bit closer to reality. So assuming we're going to spend a little bit more, and basically the point of this is, and it's a little bit irrelevant, but it's to make the point that if we continued at current course and speed, and we came in with our usual spending patterns, we would end 2020 with about a $9.1 million deficit. That is obviously, given our revenue picture, not sustainable. If we continued spending at this rate, it would reduce fund balance by this $9.1 million, which would bring fund balance down to about 13% of expenditures, which is below the fund balance target that our financial management policies have established. As a reminder, our financial management policies set a fund balance target of 15 to 20% expenditures, this would bring it down to 13%. And not only would we be below that target, but it also would leave us very little wiggle room if the revenue picture deteriorated, if there were other unexpected things coming our way to respond. Once fund balance is spent, it's hard to bring that back, particularly in this climate. So the administration is recommending that we reduce expenditures to align them to our new revenue reality. And as Andrea will be talking about in a few moments, we're going to be in the coming weeks looking at developing recommendations about how to get there. And then before I turn it over to Andrea, I did want to take a few more minutes to talk about on slide 9 a few other revenues that we're watching.
Dr. Goldberg, this is the mayor. I went at Councilmember Walsh in with a question before you move to the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. So, Director Goldberg, you said that if we were to continue on our current spending trend, we would end up with that $9.1 million deficit coming out of fund balance. Is it safe to assume that since we've been living this scenario for, to a certain extent for the last month, that we have already suffered some of that, and until we act, that money is necessarily coming out of fund balance? Is that a safe assumption?
I would say that depends. Yes, we're a month into this. We don't exactly know how the last month looked for our revenues because of the lag in the data. But I think what we're recommending is that based on the forecast that we're presenting tonight, that we use that is what we're planning to, and that we needed to develop a strategy basically for, the last 8 months of the year about how we're going to address that gap. So, is that through reductions that we would assume, basically, May through December, or is it, a combination of fund balance? That's really the policy discussion that the council's going to need to have about how much of this is going to come from expenditures versus how much of it will come from fund balance. And in an ideal situation, the use of fund balance would be more deliberative rather than more of kind of an oops at the end of the year of we don't want to miss by the end of the year. So what we're dipping into, we would want it to be more of a deliberate decision.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Director Goldberg. I am getting some comments about some feedback, in particular when I'm coming back into the conversation. So I will try and take some longer pauses to give people time to mute their microphones, and we'll try and work on that issue. Director Goldberg.
Okay, so if we can move on to slide 9, please. Okay, I want to briefly talk about some of the other funds that we're watching. Most of this presentation has been about the general fund, but we know we've got a number of other funds that are probably going to also be facing some financial difficulty. The first of which is the street operating fund. The street operating fund gets most of its revenue from the general fund, so we've already talked about what's going on there. But it also gets revenue from the motor fuel tax. And with people driving less as they're staying at home, we're expecting that revenue to decline. And then the street operating fund also gets revenue from the REIT fund. And I will be pivoting to that as the next one listed on this slide. During the Great Recession, REIT, which is real estate excise tax, this revenue source dropped by 55%. So again, this is one that we will be watching closely, and we'll be making recommendations over the next couple of weeks about how to adjust our REIT expenditures in anticipation of a drop there. The sustainability fund that gets revenue from the general fund, we've talked about that a little bit, although it does have a healthy fund balance, so that will help. The school zone safety fund receives its revenue from the speed cameras, the traffic enforcement cameras near the high school. And when schools are closed, the cameras are not operating, and we get an estimated $69,000 in revenue per month from the operation of these cameras. So with those shut down, we're assuming that that revenue is going to contract. Again, we had been assuming a 3-month closure, but now that schools are closed through the end of the school year, we'll likely see a bigger hit than we were originally anticipating there. But again, this is a fund with a relatively healthy fund balance. And then the last fund that I wanted to talk about is the Municipal Arts Fund. This fund gets revenues from admissions tax. With the live theaters and movie theaters shut down, we're expecting that revenue to contract. And then in addition, this fund gets revenue from a percentage spent on capital projects. So if we are cutting back on capital spending, we may have less money than going into the Municipal Art Fund. So we will be doing that analysis again in the coming weeks. And with that, I'll pause again for questions.
Thank you. I keep typing, but okay. We have a quick question from Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Pauly. This is Councilmember Zach Hall. Can you speak a little bit to the lodging tax fund too? I noticed that was mentioned in the agenda packet, but any additional information you have would be helpful.
Yeah, so that's another revenue that we're expecting contraction as people are frequenting hotels less. That is a fund that also has a healthy fund balance, and the spending of those revenues is set by the LTAC committee. So any changes that we make in those fundings that would be required for that fund, we would also need to involve LTAC as well.
Thank you very much. A quick follow-up, if I may, Mayor Pauly. Beth, can you remind me, do you know who the members of the LTAC committee are?
I do not know. Does maybe the mayor or city administrator know?
Off the top of my head, this is the mayor. I believe that it's Councilmember Goodman, but we'll let her weigh in, and it is. Councilmember Goodman is the chair of the LTAC committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. I am not seeing any more questions, so we can move to part of the presentation. Thanks.
And for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy City Administrator Snyder.
Thank you, Beth. This is Deputy City Administrator Andrea Snyder. Good evening, everybody. So my portion of tonight's presentation is going to cover what is the city doing to respond to the anticipated hit in revenue. And in short, we are examining all of our expenditures. So we can move to slide 10. We're examining all of our expenditures. There are a few areas that we'll be focusing on tonight, but please know that we are really taking a look at everything. And as part of that effort, we have already made some changes to how we are approaching staffing. So first on that list, there's a hiring freeze in effect. We have frozen a number of positions and stopped recruitments. So far, those savings total $640,000 overall for budget savings and stopping those recruitments. And we examined that as the months proceed, there will be additional recruitments that we stop as well, making exceptions for essential personnel such as police officers, for example. And we are examining other cost reductions that could come with staffing. I know that in the past couple of days, we've been talking about looking at benefits
looking at options for furloughs and other reductions as well. Slide 11, please, or next slide.
City Administrator Snyder, I believe we have a question from Council President Hunt on this.
Great.
Yes, this is Council President Hunt. So on the last slide, with the cost savings from the stopped recruitments so far, is this a rate that we would expect to continue to accrue over time? And if so, what's the rate? So over how long has this money accrued so far?
So the $640,000 is an estimate, and assuming that we've stopped those recruitments through the rest of the year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then a quick follow-up. We also had adopted in our last budget a 1% estimate of that included not filling positions on salary, and so is that savings overlapping with this stopped recruitment savings, or is this completely separate from that?
This savings is by and large over and above the 1% that we had anticipated. Knowing that the 1% also includes savings from moments in time when the position may not be filled, but we're under recruiting and waiting for that position to be filled. This is in addition to that anticipated 1%.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Administrator.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Moving on to slide 11, as we're looking at all components of our work plan, we're really especially paying special attention on those projects that rely on outside consultants and professional service contracts. Essentially, we are sorting this work into 3 buckets. Which projects should move forward as planned, which projects should not move forward, and which projects should move forward but with a reduced scope, including perhaps more in-house work or perhaps just a reduced scope altogether. As we kind of go through that sorting effort, and we'll be bringing back our recommendations to City Council later this month, we are looking at criteria, and this is something that we would like Council's feedback on this evening. We're looking at what are some of these considerations that we should be making and taking into account as we examine our projects and certainly our professional service contracts. So when the strategic plan was formed, it was understood that the strategic plan would guide our efforts over and above our mandated or core or essential services. And at this point, due to the significant reduction in revenues that we have forecast, we anticipate being limited to providing really those core or mandated services and that we won't be able to achieve progress on most of our strategic plan items budgeted for this year. And so you see the first criteria that we have in this list on slide 11 is the core or mandated city service. Is it a core mandated city service? If it is, then it's something that we will look at proceeding with, but maybe making into other considerations for how we can reduce costs and expenditures. Then is it a project that would require a significant amount of public engagement and dialogue, especially over the next few months? That's going to be, our ability to do that is going to be really limited. We have some online tools for engagement, and we can be using those, but even to get public attention while people are trying to work from home, while kids are home from school, there's just added complexity in people's lives. And of course, people are really focused on the public health crisis. So public engagement over the next 3 months is our ability to do that is really limited. And any project that's going to require that over the next 3 months, or perhaps even more, we're going to really take another hard look at. Source of funding. So is it general fund? Is it something that we have grant funding or private funds? Some of the projects that we're looking to execute are within an agreement, a development agreement. Some of the projects we already have state funding, and we will lose that funding if we don't move forward with that project. So these are considerations that we're making, And there may be even projects that do have grant funding that we come back and recommend that we don't move forward with because there's a city matching component, or there's a staffing capacity issue, or some other issue that makes that project difficult to complete. But certainly where the funds are coming from is something that we're taking a look at. Staff capacity to perform the work. I touched on this briefly just before. As we look at stopping recruitments, having a hiring freeze, other types of staffing reductions in hours or otherwise that come that we consider, do we have the staff capacity to perform the work? Also, can the project be stopped? Some of our projects are difficult to stop pending where they are in progress. I think about some of our capital projects in public works, for example. Some of them are essential infrastructure that we are doing and would be in a very awkward place to stop. And then, again, can the scope be reduced for professional services contracts, especially looking at how we can modify those scopes of work and perhaps reduce what the deliverables are so that we can reduce the expenditures in kind. Now, this is just a starting list of criteria that we have so far been working with. In a little bit, the direction that we're asking from City Council tonight is on these criteria, and if you have additional criteria, looking for discussions on that, and also feedback on priorities. And I'll pause here for questions.
Thank you. I see that Councilmember Walsh has a question right now.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. This is Councilmember Walsh. Deputy City Administrator Snyder, can you give us a sense of scope as to what percentage of our budget is professional service contracts? Something that tells us, hey, if we make changes here, that will affect 1% versus 50% of our budget, for example.
I cannot, actually. I'm sorry. I don't have an estimate for overall in terms of city budgets in any one fund or across all funds, how many of them are professional service contracts. I'm sorry, but that's something that we might be able to get to you. I understand that it's one of our significant expenditures as we look at staffing, and then I think the next largest overall category of spending might be professional services contracts. I look to Finance Director Goldberg to correct me on that, but I believe it's a substantial portion.
We would have to, this is Beth Goldberg, we would have to gather that data. I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Walsh. Deputy City Administrator, if you'd like to continue.
Thank you, Mayor. So as we move to slide 12 for the next slide, another thing that I wanted to talk about was the assessment of city services. It's something that we discussed at length when considering the 2020 budget. And while we look at some actions that we can take immediately in areas of staffing or the projects that we're doing, we're also taking the time to look ahead into the future. And with COVID-19, as our priorities have changed to responding to the public health crisis, and as we've been working from home, our priorities have shifted that have been able to help us reassign some staff to work on the assessment of city services internally, which we anticipate will save the majority of the $250,000 adopted in the 2020 budget and general funds that we had anticipated to spend on this work. So we look to that assessment of city services specifically when we look at the Development Services Department, or DSD as it is written on this slide. So the first body of work that we're doing is a cost recovery study on whether the DSD revenues, permit fees, specifically at our other revenues, are paying for the services provided by DSD. I think we need to have a good understanding of that. The next step, once we determine that, is to return to council and have a greater discussion on where we would like to be. I think we have a target in our financial policies that's somewhere between 70 and 75% subsidizing, or rather that DSD revenues would cover 70 or 75% of the DSD expenses. And I think we need to look at, or the study aims to find out how close we're getting to that target. And then I think that will help inform a council discussion as to whether it should be 70% or whether we need to have other considerations given our hit to revenues. The other part of that, so once we kind of get that information, then if council determines that it would be prudent and necessary to look at increasing development services fees and permit fees, then we would move forward with that work internally as much as possible as well to help inform future conversations in 2020 or perhaps the budget in 2021. The next piece of this assessment of city services is also looking at the jail and municipal court. Both for the jail and municipal court, we have interlocal agreements in place with other cities to provide these services for them. And we are taking the time to gather the data to determine how well do our local contracts and what we charge these other jurisdictions for these services really cover the cost of providing these services, and are we achieving the economies of scale for Issaquah and these other cities by providing these services. And again, that data, once we have it, will then further inform our approach moving forward as to whether we need to revisit some of the fees outlined in those agreements or not, and whether we consider how we provide for jail services and municipal court services in the city of Issaquah. I'll pause for a question.
Thank you. We do have a question from Councilmember DeMichelle.
Thank you. I do not know how extensive if we get any revenue or a significant amount of revenue for venue and building rentals. Are we including that in this study of cost recovery? Because that could be significant depending on how much revenue or how much that activity takes place. Do you have any idea about whether that should be included in this overall assessment of cost recovery?
So I think that we are, sorry, this is Andrea Snyder speaking. I think that we are already considering that in terms of the budget reduction exercise as we speak with the Parks, Recreation, and Community Services Director and his staff on those facilities. I think that's information that we already have a little bit more readily available, and the analysis that's required for DSD, jail, municipal court is just a little bit more expensive.
Thank you.
Deputy City Administrator, I'm going to see if Administrator Bobkowitz wants to add something to that.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I think what we're trying to illustrate with this slide in the portion of Andrea's presentation is these are the things that we want to do right away. We think that they will have the most impact to that. Certainly we have talked about other looks at other costs. Certainly our facilities, our rentals are all part of that. But given the current circumstances, we want to focus on those things that we think will have the greatest impact. And I think as the year progresses, we'll be able to take on more. But these are the handful of things that we think will have the most impact over the next a couple of months.
Thank you.
This is the mayor. We have a question from Councilmember Marks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm a little confused. These are not things that would have impact. These are activities that would help us plan the things that we would do that would have impact. These all have timelines associated with them and how long they would take, and the staff and or external consultants that would be required to accomplish these things. So I'm wondering what the sort of timelines are If someone pulled the trigger on doing these things, what's the timeline before decisions could be made and revenue changes realized? Thank you. Oh, this is Councilmember Martz, by the way.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. City Administrator Bobkowitz.
Councilmember Martz, members of the council, we are doing the DSD review now. Our hope would be to come back to the council with information, hopefully actionable items in the next 45 to 60 days. The jail and municipal court work is also something that is now beginning. I don't have a specific time frame for that, but I would hope that not long after mid-year, if it was feasible for us to come back to the council with some information, we would do that. We understand that these are important. As Andrew has indicated, we're reallocating staff resources to take this on. We don't believe we're going to need to use outside resources. We see these as opportunities for some significant savings, or at least to provide information to the council to consider that for significant savings.
Thank you.
Thank you, City Administrator Bobkowitz. Deputy City Administrator Andrea, would you like to continue?
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I'm going to interrupt you right away and let you know that Councilmember Walsh has a question. Sorry about that.
That's great.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. To follow up on Councilmember Martz's question, my understanding is that at least with the jail and the municipal court that we have contracts with other agencies and cities and municipalities. Do we have a sense, are those contracts through the end of 2020 that we couldn't get out of? Is there a lag time between us making a decision and actually seeing revenue and cost differences?
Thank you,
City Administrator Bobkowitz.
We are looking at all that right now. Councilmember Walsh, members of the council, we take all this extraordinarily seriously as being something that we need to move on. If we can, we will bring to the council how these contracts perhaps can be amended. We will work with our partners. We are still in the first stages of that. But we will not let length of time be an initial obstacle for these contracts. We want to be as diligent as we can. We think the circumstances before us are significant enough that we will work to open these contracts up as need be.
Thank you. Deputy City Administrator Snyder, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So moving on to slide 13, please. As we look to next steps, we are planning coming back to the City Council at the regular council meeting on April 20th to provide our recommendations for the work plan adjustment and also recommendations related to workforce for how we would reduce some of our expenditures. And as City Administrator Bobkowitz indicated, the timeline for the city assessment of services pieces is a little bit farther out as we look at a 45-day time horizon and being able to provide an update to City Council with more information in May. And unless there's no questions on next steps, then I'd like to go over some of the direction that is still needed for your discussion and consideration tonight. Is we are looking for feedback on criteria and any other kind of general feedback and input that City Council can provide on funding priorities. And so, Tina, if it's helpful, if we could, I'll pause for questions here, and then we might need to go back to slide 11 for that list of criteria again.
Thank you, Deputy City Administrator. This is the Mayor. Deputy Council President Ray has a question, and then before we actually start the feedback section, I do have some comments that I want to share with the Council. Deputy Council President Ray.
Unmute. There we go, trying to find my mute. Hi, this is Councilmember Chris Ray. A couple of questions, and I think I'm going to rewind actually a bit into revenue because I need to have the revenue picture before I feel like I can give you feedback on the expense picture. Well, were there, so this is calling Director Goldberg back to the forefront. Were there some underlying assumptions that you made in terms of the length of the stay-at-home order and or the time for an economic rebound when you were factoring in your estimating for the reduction in revenue?
Yes, in some areas, yes, and in some areas, no. So revenues that were tied directly to a service, for example, recreation activities, court activities, I cited poll tabs. For those kinds of revenues, we assumed a 3-month shutdown. But for the big four revenues, it's difficult to figure out how those revenues are going to perform. And so for those, looked really at our experience during the Great Recession as the benchmark to tie those forecasts to. Certainly how these perform over time will depend, as you noted, on the length of the shutdown and then how quickly we bounce back. In the early weeks of this emergency, there was a sense that it was going to be like a V-shaped recovery, like a sharp decline, and then we would bounce back pretty quickly. I think as the shutdown persists, I think there are growing concerns that the economic fallout of this could linger. But, as I said at the outset, this is unprecedented. We don't have an experience like this, so it's really hard to predict how the revenues will perform on the back end. And so with that, if I could just add one more point, that requires vigilant monitoring, regular monitoring of the revenues, and certainly as we get real-time data, that is going to be extremely informative to say, okay, what were these forecasts on the mark or were they not? So we'll be waiting and watching.
Okay, lots of course corrections. Thank you.
This is the mayor. A couple of points. Deputy Council President Ray, thank you for finishing off revenue questions. What I'd like to do is make sure that if any other council members have questions on revenues before we move to the feedback part, I'd like to give you an opportunity to do that now. So while I'm waiting, I also would like to give the council president an opportunity to summarize any public comments that emailed to the council before we start to take the feedback. So I'm not questions, so I'll go to council president.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So we did receive some feedback specific to this informational item that was in our packet this evening. One correspondence we received that I think relates to this was from Debbie Lacey, Eastside Refugee and Immigrant Coalition and Eastside for All. And she wrote to us about that it is imperative that our cities provide financial support to a range of organizations and to be mindful of the Eastside's diverse populations and needs during this crisis and to remain committed to values of equity and inclusion. And then additionally, Steve Pereira wrote to us about this financial update section, and he wanted to summarize his comments. He was interested in seeing criteria for how the items support Issaquah's vision, mission, goals, and objectives. And that's a summary of the correspondence that we've received that I think directly relates to this.
Thank you, Council President. So before we move into actually the feedback session, I just wanted to give another chance for Council to ask any questions on the slides and the material that was presented by the Deputy City Administrator. So I'll give a few seconds here to see if there are any additional questions. I'm not seeing any come up. I wanted to provide some comments before we went into the feedback section because I want the council and the community to understand what the administration is going to do with this information. So while we know tonight that there is no formal action being requested on this agenda item, we are asking for feedback. We started off with a very detailed presentation from our finance director on the revenue picture. And the next phase of this is going to be the direction provided by council on expenditure reductions. So we're asking for feedback in a couple of areas. The evaluation of project criteria, and Deputy City Administrator Snyder can put the slide back up and we can facilitate that conversation first, but also looking at some point for some general feedback on our proposed funding priorities. These next couple of weeks are going to be difficult. There's a lot of work still to do and a lot of difficult decisions that need to be made. I hope that the City Council provides a lot of input tonight on these criteria so that the administration will be able to be making adjustments to the delivery of services and programs. My plan as mayor is to move forward with these adjustments, which will include staff reductions and a report back to the City Council on April 20th. Stating I would like to review the changes and seek any comments the City Council might have. It's my plan to take the information provided by you tonight to prepare information for the April 20th meeting in order to implement changes on May 1st. And I wanted to put this information out there for your consideration while you're providing your feedback this evening. I am seeing council members starting to weigh in on making comments. Deputy City Administrator Snyder, if you'd like to put the slide back up first on project evaluation criteria, professional service contract criteria, we can start there. And I'm going to start the discussion with Councilmember Marks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Would it be all right if I spoke to funding priorities first?
I don't see why not. If the body would like to flip the order of providing feedback, I think we could do it. My preference is that rather than have everybody providing feedback on both, that we take one of these areas at a time. So I'm not seeing anybody opposed to the idea. So if we start with funding priorities, let's do that. Deputy City Administrator.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is Councilmember Tolomartz. So we were facing restructuring already, as we knew, as we talked about at the end of the budget last year. We had fundamental structural questions that we were having the administration consider. And now we have this higher urgency with the funding shortfalls we see right now, as well as a recession of unknown length in front of us. We have to temper the urge to cut with the fact that the cuts themselves can be harmful. The cuts themselves can impact our community directly and indirectly, as well as potential revenue increases that we might choose can be harmful. So how to parse what's in front of us? I believe that we have to sort of bifurcate what's in front of us into two categories. And the first is what is around making sure our citizens are safe and secure. And to me, that's running water, sewer, garbage service, working street signals, uniformed officers on the street, and firefighters to go on call. And that is one category of expenditures, and then there's everything else. And I would submit that what I hope to see is that category of the things that involve safety and physical security of our residents that we attempt to separate that out and not touch those areas, and rather have our funding challenges or funding changes occur in the other body of work. I recognize that those things that I just stated are probably 50% of our budget, possibly more. So I recognize that that suggestion is incredibly impactful on what we choose to do. But I think that that's where we find ourselves. And I think that those are, if there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the municipal level, those are our most fundamental priorities, and that nothing else functions if our residents and our businesses folks are not safe and physically secure where they're located. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. This is Councilmember Walsh. My thoughts and feelings on our funding priorities are fairly similar to what Councilmember Martz had just said. I think we need to make no mistake and recognize that we're facing a $10 million shortfall plus unknown risk going beyond that. My funding priorities are the health and safety of our residents, which means continuing to fund police force, fire response, water, sewer, all of those areas. Beyond that, I want to limit our risk and maintain our fund balance, understanding that at the very least, we have to remain solvent and recognizing that it will likely get worse, and we need to be prepared for that. I'm in favor of any restructuring and service assessment. And beyond the health and safety and kind of core functionalities, I would put a preference on human services and economic development. Those are going to be the areas that I feel are going to be most needed going forward. And beyond that, I prefer keeping our existing employees over anything that we're doing with professional service contracts. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Walsh. Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. This is Councilmember Zach Hall. I may ask to speak again because I'm still churning on all of this, but one thing that's top of mind for me is that, well, I agree with Councilmember Martz and Walsh that public safety is critical, and I'm not sure we can necessarily put something off to the side and not touch it at all. But my point of view would be that I would like to visit discussions around, when it comes to budget savings, I would like to visit discussions around public safety and fund balance very last. I think we work backwards through looking everywhere else in the budget and then see where we're at. See if it's appropriate at that point to consider using fund balance, to consider making modest cuts to public safety. But my first piece of direction for administration would just be to work backwards from everything else then to the public safety realm and the use of fund balance.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. Next is Councilmember DeMichelle.
Thank you. Before I start to speak, I just want to acknowledge again what Finance Director Goldberg said, and that is we're really in unprecedented times, and we don't have all of the information in front of us. We may not have all of the information in front of us 2 weeks from now, and so we will do the best we can. But the things that we talk about tonight may be completely changed in 2 weeks, and I think we need to acknowledge that we're, as Beth said, we're flying a little bit blind here. I agree overall with Councilmember Martz and Councilmember Walsh's statements regarding our top priority needs to be the health, safety, and security of our community. But I also agree with Councilmember Hall that I think everyone is going to have to compromise. Everybody's going to have to sacrifice something, even the people in our core services. And the framework I'd like to put on this is shared sacrifice. And I've thought a lot about this, and I think that means shared sacrifice from everyone, from the council to every single employee in our organization. So we're all going to have to give a little. I believe that human services, given the job losses that we're seeing and the economic impact we're already undergoing, are going to be part of that health, safety, and security. I think that their value has been demonstrated many times over in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And so I would include them in those core services. And then in that context, and again, understanding the unprecedented crisis that we are facing, I think that one of my values would be to try and save as many jobs as we possibly can. And I know that we won't be able to save everyone's job, but I would like to have that elevated as one of the values that we're looking at, and one of the values that we would like to keep on the top of our mind. It's just a difficult environment out there, and it's going to get much more difficult over the next few months. So, and also just a note of appreciation for the council and the mayor and the leadership that we've seen from Wally Bobkowitz and many, many others in our organization. I'm so appreciative and proud of the work that's already been done. And thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. Next up is Deputy Council President Ray.
Thank you, Mayor Pauly. This is Councilmember Chris Ray. So there's an assumption I'd like to challenge, and it is the assumption that things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. I guess maybe I'm a glass half full kind of person, but I find that our financial estimates, though I understand the methodology behind them, and I understand the uncertainty in our environment, I find them to be based on more than worst case scenarios. And so I don't know that we're going to see those kind of reductions, but from a sales tax perspective, I bet you when we look at March sales tax, because of the booms that we've seen in many of our retail institutions here, we're not going to see a drop in sales tax of 30%. So I'm less pessimistic that our financial situation is as dire as we are thinking it is. That being said, we do have some obligations, and first and foremost, of course, is protecting the people who live in the city. And so that's police and fire and maintaining our roads and our water system. But the thing that comes very top of mind to me is if we're talking about filling this gap, we're not going to fill this gap by reducing our investment in professional services. The only way to fill a $9.1 million gap is with some fairly draconian reductions in staff. And that, where I sit, makes this problem worse, because one of the problems that we are facing right now is people are seeing uncertainty, and they're hunkering down in uncertainty, and they are laying people off, and they're making the problem worse. And it is usually Councilmember Martz who quotes Roosevelt or Churchill, but I'm going to do it this time. And we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And I think we need to be prudent here, but we also need to not be overreacting at this moment. So I'm going to counsel that, or recommend, or provide my guidance that we be very circumspect when we're starting to think about the level of cuts that would be required to fill a $9.1 million gap out of a $50 million general fund budget. and we might never recover from doing that. So let's go carefully, let's go cautiously into this, and we don't need to be making these decisions, these massive kind of cuts at this point from where I sit. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Council President Ray. Council President Hunt.
Thank you. So I wanted to, this is Council President Hunt, I wanted to start off by thanking all of the hardworking people at the city, because I think that this is a very difficult time for our community, and it's a difficult time for the city employees. And as Councilmember DeMichelle talked about, this is a time where everybody is having to make sacrifices, and I think there's a lot of people that are really stepping up, and I just wanted to express my thanks and also to acknowledge that these conversations that we're having are going to impact real people, real families. I think that the projected impacts are very stark. I firstly appreciate the administration bringing this forward and being very direct about the projected financial implications, and I very much trust that this honesty and transparency will continue, and I'm very thankful for that, and very appreciative that we got this update when we did, and I hope to continue getting updates and to track this, because it is an evolving situation, and as was stated earlier, it's also unprecedented, and there's a lot of unknowns. So I think we need to all be aware of that and to track the evolution of this situation carefully, and I appreciate seeing this first look because I think we're going to have to continue looking at this over time, and the sooner we can get ahead of making some changes, I think that's for the best. In thinking about the funding priorities overall, I wanted to also clarify the council's role and the mayor and the administration's role. This has been something that I've been thinking a lot about, because this is a different sort of conversation than what we usually discuss at council. So I did look to the Municipal Research Services Council for guidance, and in their handbook they talk about council's role is to discuss, develop, and adopt city policies governing many aspects of city operations. And then for the operations themselves, this really is the purview of the mayor. So the direct operations as far as the hiring and layoffs and furloughs, those sorts of things are the purview of the mayor. But council adopts the policies, and council also adopts the goals and priorities. So I think that in having these conversations, which we'll continue to have, it's important to make sure that we are providing feedback in a way that reflects that we understand those differences. From my side, I've really been looking to the strategic plan, because I think that the strategic plan, it remains our strategic plan. We had a lot of public comments, we had a lot of good community engagement, and a lot of voices that went into the strategic plan. And I think it continues to be our guiding light. I know that we will not be able to do things at the same pace that we thought we would. This definitely affects that. But I also think that those core values that we went to with the community in the strategic plan, those remain our core values. I also think that we need to make changes now to change course in the short run, to actually be able to revisit our long-term mission and to get back on course for long-term mission, because we are seeing, we have these projections of this very drastic potential revenue reduction. And so I think we need to take proactive action now to do some course correction so that we can continue to provide core essential services and so we can continue to provide the services and the goals that we've put forward in our strategic plan. So in the long run, I think our mission in the strategic plan and that we can reaffirm today as a council is that we want to foster a safe, vibrant, livable, and inclusive community through effective stewardship and quality public services. And right now, I think we have to focus on safety and health of our community as has been stated by other council members. And I think we need to also look to the strategic plan for the other goal areas and think about how we might continue to affirm those values, but with different revenue projections than we thought when we went into this year and future years.
Thank you, Council President. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman here. I agree with a lot of what I've heard. Of course, our safety and security as a community is the most important thing, as is all of our obligations that we have as a city, running a city. The core services and the core obligations that we have are the most important, and also that our guide that we have as the strategic plan going forward helps us determine which things we're going to work on and accomplish for our community, just not on the timeline, probably not on the timeline that we had initially talked about. How do I say it? In direct response to Councilmember Ray's comment about the numbers and the dire projections that we have, I agree they're dire, and I also remember, I think his Director Goldberg that says to us, and she's probably not the only finance director we've had who said this to us, and that is the only thing that we know is that the numbers today will not be accurate in the very near future. We all know that that's true. That's always true, with the exception of the ending for 2019. Thank you. That ended up to be very what we thought it was going to be when she told us earlier. Ended up about what she projected it was going to be. So that is good. I would rather have the projections err on the side of being overly conservative and overly cautious. I would like to be surprised in a good way. So I do think that we have to prepare for what we know today are unprecedented times and things that are happening that we have no idea what's going to happen in 2 weeks or 2 months. We don't know if there's going to be a next round of this, if things flatten and then they spike up again in the fall or next year until we have an immunization, until we have all of this better handled and know what we're dealing with and know how to protect ourselves. We just don't know what's going to happen. So I think I would rather err on that side of not knowing what's going to happen and protect ourselves financially. Although I do agree with Councilmember Ray that things could certainly turn out better than we have predicted, and that would be great news. But right now, I think we have to assume almost the worst, which is significant reductions. I also have faith that the administration is being very thoughtful in what they will be, the actions they will take and the recommendations that they will be making. Nobody wants the kinds of cuts that we're talking about. Nobody wants layoffs. As Council President Hunt said, these are real people, these are real families, and we talk a lot about, but we have talked a fair amount over the last couple of meetings about the most vulnerable folks in our community, and the people who work for the city are people with families as well. Unfortunately, we're at the point where we have to think about reductions in some way, and those are just reality. I am not at this time in favor of looking at fund balance for unsustainable spending. To me, that seems irresponsible. We have a healthy fund balance because we've been prudent, and I think because of the unprecedented time that we're in and not knowing what's in the future, I think it's too early to talk about spending fund balance. So I don't know what the answers are. You asked for our feedback on priorities, and we've all given, in the first tier of our answer, I think we've all given the same answer. And then from there, I think we all veer a little bit. But that's my response right now. And I also want to, like what everybody else said, very much appreciate the city's quick response, honest, direct, transparent, and I just can't thank you enough for all of the hard work that you all have done in the last several weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. The feedback has been great. I do see that we have a few council members that may want to add some additional comments. So if you would like to speak, please add your name to the list. Right now, I'll go to Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Pauly. This is Councilmember Zach Hall. I just wanted to, now that I've stewed a little bit more, I wanted to advocate for a couple additional priorities of mine, especially in having conversations over the weekend with community members that I know from all over Issaquah. There are a couple things that came up over and over again, and one was human services grant funding, and then to some extent parks maintenance. So with regard to grant funding preservation, I read a Crosscut article this morning entitled "Pandemic Could Empty Washington Food Banks in 2 weeks." So obviously I'm worried that we're just trading one public health crisis for another, and playing my hand here. The Issaquah Food and Clothing Bank is on my mind today, and I'd like us to do everything we can to preserve funding streams for these organizations to the extent that we can, that support those in our community who are most vulnerable and most affected by the public health crisis. And actually, I think my head's still stewing on fund balance. I agree with what Councilmember Goodman said about that, but I see potentially using fund balance in this space as the most responsible use of that funding, as opposed to salaries, which would be a regular expense. So that's what I'm thinking there. Then secondly, parks maintenance, especially as people are cooped up in their stay home, stay healthy order. Our residents really rely on their ability to go for a stroll or a run or walk their dog through our great parks here in our great park system here in Issaquah. I see this as a mental health benefit that we provide to our residents too. So I'd like to make sure that we are being mindful of not just the health of our parks, but the health of our residents in our conversations around parks maintenance and parks and rec funding. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. Councilmember Ray, or Deputy Council President Ray. I can come back to you if you have dropped off. I'll go to Councilmember Mark.
I just have trouble finding the mute button. Hi, this is Councilmember Chris Ray, the mute challenged one. I want to come back to something I was talking about earlier, and something we heard loud and clear from Director Goldberg and also from Deputy City Administrator Schneider, which is we are living through unprecedented times. We don't have any good touchstones to say this is what this looks like. And so we're using 2008 as our best estimate of what this is going to look like. And I think this is a completely different situation than 2008. And so I think my perspective is different than many of my colleagues, because I think I'm looking at this through a different and maybe more optimistic lens. But I just pulled up the University of Washington data on the COVID outbreak. And I've been watching over the last many days when, 4 days till we have our peak or 7 days till we have our peak. And I just looked today. I just took a peek at the peak today. And our peak was 4 days ago per their projections. So we don't know what this is. And I would advocate for using fund balance, because I think this is a once in a many lifetime experience. And this is not something that's going to last and affect us for years and years. This is going to be, in my estimation, something that'll we will rebound from. And it may not be a V. It may look more like a bathtub before we rebound, but we will rebound. So from where I'm sitting, the worst thing we can do right now is to contemplate laying off or furloughing our city employees, because we're asking our employers and we're saying, oh, please try to keep people on the payroll as long as you can. And I think that's a talk we should walk, and we have the fund balance to maintain some of that staff for some period of time. So as you're looking at this, be creative and recognize that we don't have to do it all at once. And if this does go from bad to worse, we can stage it in. But I think to me, more important than even providing supports for those who have been laid off is not to add people to the pool of those who have been laid off.
Thank you, Deputy Council President Ray. Next up, I have Councilmember Marks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think this question of ending fund balance is important and certainly sounds like where we have the most difference of opinion on the council. I sure hope Councilmember Ray is right. I sure hope a year from now he and I are having a beer at the Sunset Ale House and he is, triumphantly pointing out to me that he called this. But I have concerns. I agree. I follow the IHME projections closely. Things are looking good. Things are looking better in Western Washington. We're certainly leading the country in good public policy. But there's so much we just don't know. The global pandemic, the extent to which India and Brazil and Nigeria and Mexico will develop substantial infections. Many of those countries are experiencing the kind of growth that we were seeing 2 months ago, they're seeing now. And as already been mentioned, the possibility of secondary waves, that as people return to work and as they return to parks and as they return to life, that without herd immunity or a vaccine, I know many medical people that tell me they're very, very concerned about the second wave, and nobody knows how to model that yet. So I think being prudent is the right way to go. Around the subject of ending fund balance, one thing, because I honestly don't know where I stand on using ending fund balance. I mentioned earlier that cuts are harmful in our community. Raising costs like increasing utility taxes can be harmful on our community. Part of me sees the old Keynesian economics of priming the pump during a recession. But I also I come back to what has served us well for the last 11 budgets that I've been involved in, which is you don't use ending fund balance to address fundamentals in your business or in your budget model. You use it for one-offs and you use it for the exception handling. And I will use an example to maybe inject a slight amount of humor into what's otherwise a very serious evening. To use an example, let us say one was inclined to want to see Tibbetts Valley Manor sold. And if you were considering a if you were considering spending some small amount of money to do an assessment of whether there would be a benefit to selling Tibbetts Valley Manor, the expenditure that would occur, that's a one-time cost to address a capital asset. That's the kind of investment that using ending fund balance seems 100%, whether one agrees that you should sell Tibbetts Valley Manor or not, that kind of one-time cost to help with restructuring, to help with understanding our capital assets, that is exactly, I think, the kind of thing that historically the city has felt was a good use of ending fund balance, regardless of if this particular emergency rises to the level that we want to address structural deficits by using ending fund balance. So that I would encourage the administration to consider that criteria of whether something is papering over of a fundamental budget issue or whether it's a one-time as part of righting the ship type cost. Thank you. And this is Councilmember Martz.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Next up, I have Council President Hunt.
Yes, this is Council President Hunt. I had a similar comment to Councilmember Martz on the fund balance question, because I think that we do have a financial policy which has a target for fund balance. It has a target for a reason, and we shouldn't not spend that money ever. We shouldn't just hold on to it endlessly for a rainy day. I think that, this is definitely a rainy day, and this is a global pandemic, and it is appropriate, I believe, to use some of and I think will be necessary to use some of the fund balance. But I agree that I think we should use that fund balance for not for ongoing, but for one time. And I think that due to the unprecedented nature of this crisis, I think we're going to have one-time unexpected costs. So that would also be what I would look to for the fund balance. But I also think that we have this target for a reason, and that's money that we should be aware that we should also make sure that we're being good stewards of that money. And if that means spending that money on one-time expenses to support quality public services for our community, then we should do that.
Thank you, Council President. Councilmember DiMichele.
Thank you. I'm like Councilmember Ray, I'm a little slow on the mute button. I had asked Director Goldberg earlier today about where we stood on the ending fund balance, and our target is 20% of our expenditures, and right now that ending fund balance is at 30%. So we have a really good, solid ending fund balance, and I take to heart Councilmember Goodman's comments and others that it is a one-time expenditure. We'll never get that money back. But one of the purposes of a ending fund balance and of a rainy day fund is emergencies. And I cannot think of a situation that is more of an emergency than what we're facing right now. So I would support a quote unquote modest dipping into the ending fund balance to help solve this problem. I don't know exactly what that looks like in terms of the exact dollar amount, but I would be willing to approve dipping into of perhaps $1 to $2 million. I don't think that we should drive the fund down to that 20% that we would like to have there. I think that this is certainly an emergency time, and we should use some of that money to address this issue. The other comment I have, and I'd like to surface this and put it on the table, is Many of our companies, private companies, I'm aware of just today, I heard of one of our major corporations in the area that is imposing a 10% salary cut across the board. And I heard of another company that's doing a 25% salary cut. Again, the goal is to save jobs, and everybody sacrifices something in that process. In following the 2008 recession, when I was an employee at King County, everybody took a 3% salary cut. It's a tool that's in the toolbox. And I had asked Director Goldberg earlier today about how much that might save. And I know that's a complicated formula, but again, it's a way of saving jobs. It's a way to have shared sacrifice. And it's another tool that we can use in addressing this issue. So I would hope that that would be part of consideration and a discussion with our employees and a discussion with our community about how we can address this issue and hopefully save as many jobs as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman here. I'll be quick. I just wanted to say that for the ending fund balance, everybody's acknowledged, everybody that's, taking part in this meeting today has either acknowledged or probably would acknowledge that not only is it unprecedented, but we are at the beginning of this. And in a sense, we have a long ways to go before we know what the fallout is, what those emergencies will be that would drive us to spend money from our ending fund balance. And so I would guess that every council member is probably not opposed to spending the money on something to help with this emergency, this unprecedented situation, but we're a month in and not going to see where we might really need to spend money to help us out of this emergency situation until we get further down the road. That's just what my comment is. Thank you.
Member Goodman, I would like to offer Councilmember Walsh, if she would like, some time to comment. Everybody else has had a second round of comments. I'm just checking in with you.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. This is Councilmember Walsh. I think my initial comments stand. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for Deputy City Administrator Schneider. If the slide that shows the consulting criteria that the administration proposes to use in looking at professional services contracts could be put back up so that the council would have an opportunity to comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I know that the city clerk has been controlling the presentation, and so I'd like to extend that question to our city clerk if they can advise.
Yes, just provide me a moment to get that back online.
Sure. While we're waiting for the city clerk, and thank you for doing that, Tina, if council members would like to comment on the criteria being used to evaluate projects and professional service contracts, if you could let me know through the comment box, we can queue up those that would like to speak to it. Okay. So while we are waiting for the slide, and if you wanted to, Council President Hunt, you have the presentation materials as well. Here they go. Okay, so we'll start with Council President Hunt, followed by Council Member Walsh.
Thank you. This is Council President Hunt. I think that the list, for me, this list of how we're looking at criteria, it is missing some prioritization criteria. So I agree that core and mandated city services, those are things we need to do. and I understand the concerns around public engagement. I basically understand these criteria, but I think it's missing some prioritization criteria. And in our strategic plan, there is some criteria about prioritizing projects and strategic actions. And so I think that list provides an additional level that would be helpful. So in that list, the criteria include the level of impact, and then it goes on to say, what is the anticipated impact of the action in making progress toward the objective? Is it aligned to our mission and values? Control over the outcome, likelihood of success, cost and time and money, and then timing and opportunity. So I think that those sorts of things, particularly the level of impact, is also important to consider. And since it wasn't in the list, I wanted to put that out there. The other thing that isn't in the list that I think would be helpful to consider at this time is if there are I think that there's a timing issue sometimes where if we're deferring a project and deferring a contract that's associated with getting a certain project completed, it might contribute to increased costs later. And so I think that sort of deferred cost versus actual cost savings should also be considered. And this also ties into the fact that we don't know the particulars of how long this crisis will continue, the economic fallout from the crisis will continue. So I think that the sort of deferral and is there a cost to not doing the work should also be included.
Thank you, Council President Hunt. Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you, Mayor Polly. This is Councilmember Walsh. I will be blunt on this one. Basically, I'm fine to eliminate all professional services contracts as needed. I think your criteria is fine. I mean, in my heart of hearts, if you could keep Title 18, I would love that. But my kind of formula is that employees are more important than consultants and getting this work done. I would rather keep our employees and have all of our projects that rely on professional service contracts be delayed than eliminate an employee in order to keep those projects going in this uncertain time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Walsh. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Goodman here. My only comment is that the one that says public engagement, and this probably goes without saying because I know you all will have a more thoughtful deliberation when you're thinking about this. But just because a project has a public engagement element, I want to be careful that we don't use that as just a criteria to eliminate something because, I mean, Title 18 is one example. So eventually there is a public engagement part to that, but there is also a lot of work to be done before we ever get to that. So I just want to make a comment to that effect that public engagement that can be put off, but work that still can be done. I want to make sure that we consider continuing some of that work to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Next, Councilmember DiMichele.
Thank you. This is Councilmember DiMichele. In the materials that were in our packet, there were two examples given of how this criteria might be applied, and the two examples were the Master Mobility Plan and then the Land Use Code update. And I just wanted to express that I have a concern about the TOD Opportunity Center project in relation to professional service contracts. And the other area I have a big concern is I believe that we use a lot of professional service contracts with road maintenance during the summer. And I don't have a particular question or comment, but I'm hoping that before the 20th, we should get a comprehensive list of the specific projects that might be impacted by this criteria and by the assessment of the staff. and that's the only comment I have. I would just like to be able to see the full breadth of what we're dealing with if we're deciding to cut professional service contracts. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. Councilmember Martz?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is Councilmember Martz. The reason why I wanted to talk about priorities first is because I think it informs how I feel about this. You know, coming back to safety and security and wanting to view those health differently, I'm pretty close to Councilmember Walsh on this. I don't think there's much that if we can, by not spending money on service contracts, if we can save jobs and have people do the work internally or defer some of the work until things are a little better, I really want to prioritize around existing staff. And so there are not many things I think that would rise to the level of being absolutely essential off the service contract list, but I would say things that relate back to turning on the tap or running water in the sink or officers on the street or firefighters in their vehicles responding to calls. Service contracts that relate to those functionalities I see as important, but the rest of it is let's try to conserve I would hope the administration would see to conserving our money for existing staff and core services. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. I'm just going to do a quick check-in. We have two more council members to hear from, Councilmember Hall and then Councilmember Ray.
Thank you, Mayor Pauly. City Councilmember Zach Hall. I genuinely don't have anything else to add. I'll just say, I completely agree with Councilmember Walsh. I think she said it perfectly. I would much rather protect our employees who work day in and day out to execute our vision and the vision of the community over contracts. So that's just where my head's at.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. Councilmember Ray is fine with what he sees on the screen. So we're continuing through the meeting, and I want to thank the staff for the presentation. And as was explained earlier, we'll be returning on April 20th with specific recommendations regarding changes to the city's work plan and workforce. I'll do a quick check-in with the city administrator, deputy city administrator, and make sure you got all the information you needed, or whether or not you had any questions for council before we proceed.
Madam Mayor, members of the council. Go ahead, Andrea.
Well, I just wanted to thank council for the wonderful discussion and input you provided today. That's been very helpful, and I believe that I have all that I need, and I'll yield the floor to City Administrator Bob Kowitz.
Nothing to add.
Thank you very much for that. So the next item on the agenda this evening is for good of the order. And is there anybody that would like to provide some information for good of the order? I am not seeing anybody show up in the comment section, but I'll keep an eye on it. I do see Councilmember Hall. Come on and join us.
Thank you, Mayor Pauly. Councilmember Zach Hall. I actually forgot to just add one comment that was kind of outside revenue and professional contracts. Can I just have a minute?
Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I wanted to make sure to encourage you, Madam Mayor, and the administration to provide a similar presentation of this, of our financial situation and the deliberations that we're going through right now to our state and federal elected officials. As many of you know, I know from experience how important this is, and I think regular communication really helps our elected representatives in Congress and in the state legislature bring real real stories to the table during decision making and during budgeting. As Councilmember Martz said earlier, that it's unfortunate Governor Inslee, vetoed this streamlined sales tax part that was in the operating budget, and it is unfortunate. It does suck, and so I think that makes it more important than ever to be sure we're keeping people in the loop about our pain, about our decision-making process, how we're going through, so that way they can take that context with them as they think from their perspective, how do we support local municipalities, especially those that have less than 500,000 people in them? How do we support community groups like the food bank, so that way the city can use their resources on essential services? I just wanted to ask that of you. Thank you.
Thank you for the suggestion. I think it's a great idea. There's actually been an amazing amount of communication recently at all levels of government, an extraordinary amount. So great suggestion. We'll take that into consideration. And now for good of the order, due to the Governor's Proclamation 20-28, all city public meetings except council meetings have been canceled through the month of April. And this includes the cancellation of board and commission meetings and council study sessions. The City Council regular meetings will continue to occur as scheduled using this remote meeting platform. April 20th, there is a regular City Council meeting at 7 p.m. The potential agenda items are the first 2020 budget amendment, 2020 budget reauthorizations, and a 2020 financial and work plan impacts of COVID-19, the second part of this evening's session. I also wanted to do a thank you to our amazing nonprofit network out there. They have been doing a great job retooling and regearing themselves to support our communities. I also want to thank Homewood Suites, who is currently providing space for our first responders if they need to stay in town or separate from their families to isolate. And to all of our hospital and medical workers, police, fire, EMTs, public works operations staff for being on the front lines and out in the community doing what needs to be done. These are courageous people that are taking care of us right now and our community, and I am absolutely humbled by their selflessness. The next item on the agenda this evening is going to be executive session, as early announced. I would like to call for a 5-minute recess as we switch into executive session and request that council members using the links provided for executive session enter the first session at 9, I'm going to give you a few extra minutes, 9:55. So with that, we'll be moving into executive session.